It was the winter of 1942. Manchester was already scarred by bombs, its streets blackened, its people weary. Yet amidst the nightly air raid sirens and the endless fear of death from the skies, a new horror struck from within its very heart. A fire so fierce and so sudden that it devoured an entire hotel and claimed countless lives. Some say it was a tragic accident, the consequence of negligence and poor safety, but others, well, they whispered something darker, a whisper of sabotage, of spies, of a secret mission concealed beneath the ashes of the Deansgate Hotel. The Deansgate Temperance Hotel first opened its doors in 1894, a proud, towering presence on the banks of the River Irwell. With almost 100 rooms, it promised comfort, respectability and sobriety to the travellers who lodged there. By the time the Second World War engulfed Britain, the Deansgate had become a familiar landmark in the city. But on the morning of February the 11th, 1942, it would become the scene of one of Manchester's darkest tragedies. At around 5 AM, and as most of Manchester slept, a fire broke out in the basement of the Deansgate Hotel. It is believed to have started in the boiler room, or perhaps a stock room. No one could say for certain, but what was certain is that the blaze spread with terrifying speed. The wooden flooring within the hotel itself acted somewhat like a kindling. The grand central staircase, as well as the lifts, they acted as huge chimneys, pulling up air and making the flames even more ferocious. Smoke began billowing out of the basement and into these stairwells, into the lifts, and eventually into the main hall. Guests woke, they were choking, blinded by smoke. They were trapped in a labyrinth now transformed into a furnace. And inside the hotel that night were 86 guests and 45 staff. But the guest register destroyed in the blaze ensured that nobody knew exactly who was inside. Now the fire brigade was quickly called for and they arrived extremely quickly to the scene. Guests, meanwhile, were opening the windows and those on the upper ground floors, they were trapped. They couldn't get down the stairwells. So they clambered onto the ledges of their room windows. The scene itself at this point had become almost unbearable. Flames were whipping round from the basement onwards. Smoke, as I said, was billowing out into the main central hallways. Those that managed to escape through the actual stairwells and the lifts, they made it to the main entrance where firemen were waiting and they threw coats over them. Now it is said that a lot of the women survivors who made their way out, they took their fur coats off and they placed them over the men that had managed to escape but who were wearing nothing but their pyjamas. Some guests even flung themselves from the windows at the backside of the hotel, and which was facing the River Irwell. Now we have to remember that this tragedy took place in February 1942, and from all accounts it was an extremely harsh winter. The River Irwell itself, whilst not frozen over, would have been extremely cold. We know one man, and his name was called Ernest, and we'll touch upon him shortly. But he sadly drowned after leaping into the River Irwell. We don't know for sure how many others may have died in such a way by jumping from these windows. One police commissioner at the time said it was very hard to know for certain exactly how many people perished by jumping from these upper floor windows. We also know that some of the survivors themselves made makeshift ropes out of bed sheets and they dangled them from the upper ground floors of the Deansgate Hotel. Now, one or two of these people also sadly, well, they sadly fell into the River Irwell from such a height. Now, as an idea and as a reference point as to what the Deansgate Hotel would have looked like and being close to the River Irwell, the Blackfriars house, which is just opposite, as you can see, is right up to the river itself. And it would have been this, or this kind of view, in which the Deansgate Hotel would have had back in 1942. And as you can see from the Blackfriars house, it is extensively high up. So for people to jump and launch themselves from those upper windows and into the River Irwell, it must have been one frightening experience. The Deansgate Hotel itself would have been situated directly in front of us on where the Treehouse apartments are now. But it would have been closer to the edge of the River Irwell. And it's in the Irwell itself where all those people, well, they jumped out of the windows, hopefully trying to get to safety. Now, if we can step back in time and into the early hours of that awful morning, there would have been what was called fire floats, and they would have been situated along the River Irwell just in front of us. And these were basically, for best of a want of word, these were tiny boats that the fire service had obviously quickly arranged to be here to rescue people who were trying to escape from the burning inferno that was once the Deansgate Hotel. One of those who jumped from this inferno was Ernest George Brown, and he was the General Secretary of the Doncaster Cooperative Society. He never made it back to shore, and his body was found weeks later, dragged from the River Irwell on the 4th of March. The first reports gave the figure, or the total number of people dead, as being 16. But it's very difficult to know for certain just exactly how many lives were lost. You see, there were many people, many names of people who had been in the hotel during the morning of that fire and whose names were ever released or disclosed to the public. And it seems very difficult to understand just exactly how that can be. These people perhaps had family members, loved ones. So to say in some reports that the total number of deaths, nobody quite knows for certain, it may be more than 16, it's very difficult to understand how that can be. Despite the reported 16 lives that had been lost inside the hotel, only 5 could be identified. Some bodies were never found, charred beyond recognition, and some bodies were in several pieces, only being identified by the rings they were wearing. Now, those identified were Miss Alice Whittaker, hotel receptionist, Miss Enid Mary Hall, housekeeper, and Miss Pearson, linen keeper of the hotel staff. The 4th victim to be identified was that of Miss Nellie Daw, employed by Annan, Dexter and co-accountants. The last victim, however, to be identified was that of Mr. John Bailey from Northampton. On the 24th of February, the bodies of 10 people were buried across 2 communal graves over at Sunderland Cemetery. There were 8 males and 2 females. Unfortunately, there were no headstones that bore their names, only the simple acknowledgement of lives ended by this disastrous fire. Now, we're not going to visit Sunderland Cemetery for today's video simply because it is such a huge place to visit. It would be like looking for a needle in a haystack to find these 2 communal graves. We did, at the start of the week, contact Sunderland Cemetery, and we did it through one of the Manchester Council websites, and it was a direct link to the cemetery itself. We emailed them, we've asked them politely if they could point us in the right direction as to where these communal graves are. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, they never replied. We didn't get a single reply back to that email. So like I said, Sunderland Cemetery, it's such a big place. We're not going to go there today because it would literally take us hours to find those communal graves, if we could ever find them. The coroner's inquest was swift and damning, but the inquest itself didn't go without any issues. One of the most important witnesses to the events of that February morning had gone missing. Now, one witness of importance, a young man, an 18-year-old man by the name of Leonard Harlick. He was a night porter on the morning of when this fire took hold, and he went missing. He disappeared within hours after speaking to the authorities after this fire broke out. We know he didn't succumb to the fire itself because, like I said, he spoke to the authorities. It was after, many hours after this fire broke out. He went missing, but he had become a person of importance. The police wanted to speak to him to get his version of events. Harlick had just simply vanished off the face of the earth. He disappeared. Now, the police put out many bulletins. They put out newspaper articles asking for the whereabouts or asking for Harlick to get in touch with them because they needed him at the upcoming inquest. Eventually, Harlick would be found. He was found working in a hotel down in London. Now, he obviously was asked to come to the inquest, and he made his way up to Manchester in March. And he would then be asked, why didn't he respond to all the hue and cry, as the press put it, to the hue and cry? And why didn't you come forward when you knew you were being chased, you were being wanted by the authorities? And Harlick simply replied saying he didn't know anything about it. He didn't know he was basically a wanted man. But he made the way up to the inquest in March, and what he would tell the authorities would kind of prove extremely valuable. Harlick's evidence, it pointed to a guest telling him something was wrong, and then he saw what looked like steam near to the lifts. He then went downstairs to the boiler room and saw smoke coming from a door leading into the stores and to the main stairs. There was nothing wrong in the boiler room, however. So as the investigation progressed, eventually the investigators wouldn't find fault with bombs, nor with saboteurs. They would find fault with the owners and how negligence had led to the deaths of many innocent people. On Thursday, the 5th of March, and after hearing evidence from several witnesses, a verdict of death by misadventure due to civil negligence was returned on the victims of the Deansgate Hotel fire. The jury added that there had been gross negligence on the part of Mr. Parker, managing director of the hotel, in omitting to issue proper firefighting directions to the staff and for failing to ensure that sufficient notices were displayed regarding means of escape to residents and staff in the event of a fire. The Deansgate Hotel, that was once branded one of the finest temperance hotels in Manchester, was now branded nothing more than a death trap. Now, as the weeks and months went by, more remains would be discovered during the excavation of the hotel. And on Thursday, the 14th of January 1943, another inquest was opened, this time on the discovery of human remains that had been found on the 4th of January at the ruins of the hotel. A number of bones were found on a ledge in what had been a room on the 5th floor of the hotel. Dr. T.H. Blench, police surgeon, said that the remains were those of a woman aged between 35 and 40 years old. Now, during this inquest, Chief Inspector Dalton, he told the coroner and the jury of how all missing persons were now accounted for, but still only 6 of these victims were identified. The 6th known victim was that of 34-year-old Mr. Stuart Morgan Fletcher. He was a public relations officer for the Ministry of Supply. Although his body was never found amongst the victims who were identified after the fire, it was considered obvious that he had lost his life in the fire. He had been staying at the hotel in the morning when the fire broke out, his bedroom being in the centre of where the fire was. But his bank accounts had not been used since February the 10th. And as the weeks went by, the months went by, more victims and more names of those who died in the Deansgate Hotel fire, they will be named. Mr. Ernest Millington, an advisor to the Director of Explosives, would, in July of 1943, be named as another victim of the fire. Whilst his wife, although viewing the body, was unable to identify it that of her husband, Mr. Millington had reserved a room, but no word, no sign of him was ever made after the fire broke out. Other names that we have found and who were presumed dead due to the hotel fire are Mr. Thomas Colton, secretary of the hotel, and he was occupying a room on the morning of the fire. We also have Mr. John Jackson, a representative of the LM&S Railway Company. He was at the hotel, just like the other named victims on the morning of the fire. His family had not heard from him since the fire broke out. And so the official statement for the record on this terrible, this tragic, awful incident was that it was just an accidental fire. It was a fire that broke out in one of the rooms, either the stock room or the boiler room, and it was unforeseen. Or was it? Was there more to this fire than originally met the eye? "17 years later, and in 1959, a very different story began to emerge. One of the survivors of that night, Major Herbert Reginald Healy, a man from the Regional Home Security Department, spoke out. And what he claimed cast a long, chilling shadow over the accepted account of the Deansgate tragedy. Healy insisted it wasn't an accidental fire, it was a thermite bomb that had caused this destruction. He had researched gases ever since the end of World War I, and he knew exactly what colour the flames were on the morning of this fire, and they were brilliantly white. He would pinpoint this colour and these extreme temperatures which would cause the brightness of these fires to be that of thermite. A thermite flame burns with an intensely bright white to yellow or white light. It's far brighter than a normal flame, so much so that looking directly at the thermite reaction without eye protection can cause temporary or permanent eye damage. Mr. Healy spoke to the Manchester Evening News, and his version of the events that took place were printed on Tuesday, the 25th of August, 1959. He told the reporters that he was beyond doubt that it was a fifth shadow conspirator or saboteur that was responsible for this fire. Now, a fifth column or a fifth columnist is an enemy supporter or spy operating inside a target area, pretending to be loyal while actually aiding the other side. And this is exactly what Major Healy described as being the person responsible for the Deansgate fire. Now, despite Major Healy's interview in the papers and him swearing that he saw what he saw in that firefighters were trying to put out this white flame, the fire commission itself pretty much ruled out that there were anything untoward which had caused this fire. They said there was not enough evidence, or there wasn't any evidence to suggest that a third party conspirator or a fifth columnist had been involved. There was just nothing to prove it. Now, to many people, this was simply a way to cover up what was going on in that hotel. Major Healy himself, as an example, he began to believe that there was a very high-ranking, important official from the Ministry of Defence staying in the hotel that evening. And this person had extremely important files. Healy's version of events basically is pointing to a saboteur coming into the hotel to destroy these files and to destroy the person carrying the files, regardless if it meant taking innocent lives with them. But the mystery still lingers. Was it truly an accident, the result of negligence in wartime Britain, or was it something more sinister, a deadly act of espionage hidden beneath the cloak of tragedy? The Deansgate Hotel never reopened. Its gutted shelves stood for decades, a silent reminder of that night. Shops returned to the ground floor in the 1950s, but the upper stories remained roofless, scarred and abandoned. Finally, in the early months of 1971, the rooms were demolished and the hotel was gone forever. 16 souls lost, some unnamed, buried together beneath Manchester's soil. Their story entwined forever with a city at war, and with a question that refuses to die, and to this day, nobody has ever come up with a satisfactory answer as to what actually caused the fire in the first place.